What if reality is a hallucination and we are only being controlled? We wake up in the morning. One moment we are completely unconscious. The next we find ourselves here. We become beings capable of thinking, feeling, and perceiving our surroundings. But we almost never ask, how does this transition happen? What does the transition from unconsciousness to education mean? And more importantly, what exactly is consciousness? These questions are among humanity's oldest and most difficult. For centuries, this subject was primarily the domain of philosophers, mystics, and artists. Because consciousness is a phenomenon that is difficult to define, difficult to understand, and cannot be directly observed. However, in recent years, science has also begun to take it seriously. Neuroscience, mathematics, and programmatic modeling, in particular, are conducting intensive research to understand consciousness. But there is an important problem here. Consciousness is a field that is rich in ideas but poor in data. Much has been said on this subject, but reaching a definitive conclusion is extremely difficult. Therefore, some studies on consciousness in recent years may be superficial, hasty, and even misleading. At this point, one of the best-known names in contemporary consciousness research comes into play, Professor Anil Seth. According to him, consciousness is a phenomenon that is as mysterious as it is misunderstood. He expressed this quite clearly years ago. Consciousness is a fascinating but comprehensive and extremely difficult phenomenon. It is impossible to say with certainty what it is, what it does, or why it exists. This statement actually reflects the long-standing view of scientists on this subject. Because consciousness is not the kind of problem supported by classical scientific understanding. It has neither clear boundaries nor easy measurements. However, Anil Seth's approach is different here. His main claim is this: consciousness is not a window reflecting brightness. Consciousness is an experience created by the brain's prediction of the external world. In other words, we don't perceive the world as it is. Our brain constructs a model of reality from the limited data we receive from our senses, and we are within this model. From this perspective, perception is not a passive recording process. It is an active process of interpretation and prediction. The brain constantly does what is likely to happen in the outside world, and it compares these predictions with the incoming sensory data. If the prediction is correct, reality appears stable. If the prediction is wrong, perception is distorted. This is exactly what hallucination is. The brain's predictions become detached from the data coming from the outside world. At this point, a surprising distance emerges. There is no sharp boundary between the reality we perceive and hallucination. Both are produced by the same mechanism. The only difference is balance. Therefore, Anil Seth defined perception as a controlled hallucination. And what about what we call self? We generally perceive the self as a fixed, unchanging essence. However, recorded data reveals a pattern showing that selves are shrinking. The feeling of being the same person stems from your brain creating a sense of continuity. But this is not an absolute truth. This self-formation occurs during sleep, anesthesia, psychedelic experiences, brain damage, or deep reproduction. So, being myself is not a fixed state. It's a recreated experience. At this point, a crucial question arises. If reality is an illusion, if the self is a model, then are we really inside it? Is it a controlled simulation or a self-governing system of consciousness? Science doesn't give definitive answers here. However, we can clearly say this: consciousness is far more fragile, flexible, and constructed than we think. This means the way we experience reality can be altered. If perceptions diverge, realities change. If self-perception changes, life experience changes. And perhaps true freedom lies here. When you realize that reality is not absolute, you gain the power to question it. But this is not about being controlled. It is about understanding how control is exercised. And perhaps this is precisely the deepest meaning a person experiences. Not just living reality, but reducing awareness of how one lives it. Change blindness and the illusion of self. People experience significant changes over time. Life circumstances change, social bonds are broken or reestablished. However, despite all these transformations, most of us still see ourselves as the same person. This is because of a powerful but deceptive sense of continuity that the mind offers us. In the science of perception, there is a phenomenon called change blindness. Although many things around us change gradually, this change is often not noticed unless it requires direct attention. On the surface, everything seems to remain the same because we don't perceive it. This situation is not unique to the external world. The same blindness applies to our perception of ourselves. Our minds prevent us from fully seeing how we change over time. This can be called internal change blindness. The brain, evolutionarily, works in a way that makes us appear more stable than we are. Because to survive, we need a sense of self that believes it can control itself, not one that constantly questions itself. Therefore, what we call self is not a constantly fixed essence. It is a controlled perception, even a kind of functional hallucination that the brain stores and preserves. The experience of being myself aims to see the world as it is, in a way that is conducive to survival. Therefore, we do not notice our change because noticing it would prevent system integration. The important thing is this: we are not changing, but because we don't see it, we don't think we are remaining the same. Controlling, hallucination, the true nature of consciousness. We perceive the world and ourselves through our bodies. Consciousness is not about integrating independently from the outside. It originates from a living, hissing, moving region. This relationship established between mind, body, and world is central to consciousness. The human mind is preserved not because it carries a soul, but because it is a living machine. The sensitivity of our cells, the predictive ability of our brain, and the functioning of our survival object give rise to consciousness. Therefore, consciousness exists not despite our nature, but precisely because of our nature. But the real difficult question begins here. How does the brain, an international system, alter personal experiences? What we call consciousness isn't just about processing information. Reacting to the environment, behaving intelligently, or performing complex actions doesn't mean being at home. A machine learning system can be acquired. A robot can walk. A plant can react to a stimulus. But being something internally isn't necessary for these things. Consciousness is the state of being something. There is the thing I am. There is the thing you are. There is an emotion an animal can feel. But being a table or a computer is nothing. Therefore, consciousness cannot be confused with intelligence, autonomy, or complexity. Consciousness is the experience itself. Its whisper is an internal scene where its perception emerges. So where's the problem? Using science, we can explain how a computer works, how neural networks receive signals, how the output comes about. These are called easy problems. But even if all this is explained, one question will remain unanswered. Why do all these physical functions lead to an internal experience? This is the hard problem of consciousness. Some solutions to this impasse expand the universe of consciousness, while others claim that consciousness doesn't actually exist at all. But one explains nothing, while the other denies the most fundamental truth of its product. Because the point is this: if there is no consciousness, there is nothing. Without experience, there is no meaning. Therefore, consciousness is not a byproduct. It is the only distribution of reality that becomes livable. And what we call I is a controlled hallucination, surrounded by the world we consume and the controls we use. But this is not a mistake. These are the most limited ranges of control necessary for survival. We see reality not as it is, but only as much as is necessary for our survival. Therefore, to say that consciousness is understood is not to admit that it is an illusion, but to understand how we control it. The real problem of consciousness: where is the mystery to be solved? The real problem with consciousness is not whether it exists or not, nor is it a property of consciousness. The experience you are currently having is directly within the power of consciousness. The real problem begins once consciousness is accepted. The real problem with consciousness is this: how does this inner world of experience emerge from physical systems like the brain and body? For many years, this question has been mishandled. Some approaches have viewed consciousness as an almost mystical essence. Others have attempted to isolate consciousness entirely, producing explanations as if consciousness did not exist. But both extremes have kept us where we are instead of exploring. The real problem with consciousness is not to look for magic or pull the rug out from under experience. The real problem is to accept consciousness as it is and make it an explainable phenomenon. The choice and experiential face of consciousness. Being conscious is not simply perceiving things. When we are conscious, we can establish a flexible and meaningful relationship with the world. We can perform different actions with the same object. We can pick up a glass of water and drink it. We cannot ignore it, discard it, or assign a completely different meaning to it. This is the functional aspect of consciousness. But consciousness doesn't end there. There's also an experiential perspective. Seeing a color isn't the same as identifying that color. There's a profound difference between experiencing an emotion and the changes in that emotion. This personal aspect is what distinguishes consciousness from an ordinary mechanism. The real problem with consciousness is being able to explain these two aspects together, both what it does and how it makes you feel. The easy problem, hard problem fallacy. The concept of easy problems and hard problems, frequently discussed in philosophy, is a crucial turning point here. Questions about how brain functions change, which neural networks are at which stage, and which stages perception goes through may be technically difficult, but they are solvable in principle. The real difficult question is, why do all these physical processes create an internal experience? But a significant mistake is made here. It's assumed that an additional self is needed in the subconscious. This was observed during the transitional period. Humans have a vital guide system for the manifestation of life. This was called vitalism. Today, we don't seek such a mysterious essence for life changes. Life can be explained by its chemical components and forms of organization. A similar approach is possible for consciousness. Understanding consciousness. by breaking it down. The real problem with consciousness is not a riddle that can be solved with one big answer. Therefore, it is necessary to proceed by addressing the different aspects of consciousness separately. This approach is based on the idea of neurophenomenology by the Chilean neurologist Francisco Varela. His basic idea is this: both brain mechanisms and personal experiences must be taken seriously to sustain consciousness. In other words, not only are external data monitored, but also what people transfer into their experiences is recorded and evaluated. This does not make explaining consciousness impossible. It simply requires a more careful and disciplined approach. The critical difference between life and consciousness. Although life and consciousness seem to have emerged similarly, there is a crucial difference between them. We can observe life from the outside. We can examine a cell, put an organism in a laboratory. But consciousness is not like that. Consciousness exists only for the organism that lives it. We cannot directly observe another person's experience. This does not mean that consciousness is unscientific. It simply shows that consciousness is different from the objects science is accustomed to. In physics, atoms are studied. In biology, they are developed. In the science of consciousness, experiences are studied. Yes, but it's difficult, but not impossible. Consciousness as a controlled hallucination. This is a powerful product of modern neuroscience. Consciousness is not the brain's reflection of the world as it is. Consciousness is an internal model created based on the brain's predictions. We don't see reality. We experience life accurately enough to ensure our survival. Even what we call the self is not static. It is a constantly updated model, adjusted to its continuity, shaped by past experiences. Therefore, consciousness is not a random hallucination. It is a controlled and functional hallucination. This hallucination exists to keep us alive. Conclusion: understanding the mystery, not destroying it, the real problem. Conscious content. How does the mind fill reality? What we call conscious experience is not an empty space. On the contrary, it is filled with objects, faces, colors, sounds, places, and meanings at every moment. Consider your current environment: the walls, the light, your body position, perhaps a sound from afar. All of these constitute the content of your consciousness. But the critical question is, does this content truly come from the outside world, or is it constructed by the mind? This is where the mystery of conscious content begins. Perception, not a photograph of the external world, but an interpretation. In daily life, most of us assume that perception is a passive process, as if our eyes were a camera, our ears a microphone. The world enters and we watch it. But modern neuroscience says the exact opposite. Perception is not about directly receiving the external world. It is about producing a meaningful story from incomplete, noisy, and ambiguous data. The brain cannot be satisfied with the signals it receives, because these signals alone are meaningless. There is no light, sound, or color inside the skull. Only electrical and chemical signals exist. The brain extracts a world from these signals. What does the lilac hunter illusion tell us? Perceptual illusions are powerful tools for understanding how conscious content is produced. The lilac hunter illusion is a striking example of this. When you focus on a fixed point, you notice that the purple patches around it disappear and are replaced by a green movement. But in reality, there is neither green nor a moving object on the screen. This shows us that, Conscious content is not a direct reflection of physical stimuli. Multiple processes are at work simultaneously. The disappearance of vague objects at the edges of the field of vision over time, the brain's production of the perception of movement, activation of color, contrasts. But the most important point is this: some of the colors you see do not exist in the outside world at all. For example, magenta. There is no such wavelength as magenta in the electromagnetic spectrum. When red and blue light appear together, the brain thinks something is missing here and internally produces that color. So what you see is the brain's prediction. The brain is a prediction machine. At this point, the basic idea becomes clear. The brain is not a perception machine. It is a prediction machine. It constantly asks the question, what might the signals I'm receiving right now be showing the outside world? These predictions are shaped by your past experiences, the state of your body, your expectations, and the context you are in. What we call perception occurs when data from the outside world meets the brain's internal models. That's why two people looking at the same event see different things, because conscious content is not only about what is there, but also about you. The dark room inside the skull. Now, to see this more clearly, imagine yourself as the brain for a moment. You are inside a closed box made of bones. You have no direct connection to the outside world. No light enters, no sound echoes. You only have electrical signals from nerve cells. These signals are, this is a tree. This is a human face. This is the color red. These are all interpretations of the brain. The brain's success lies in its ability to produce a highly coherent, continuous, and meaningful world from these limited signals. Conscious content is the result of this production. The chasm between reality and experience. The unsettling but liberating consequence of this is the world you experience is not reality itself. It is a version that works for you. This does not mean the world is fake. However, it shows that it is not an absolute copy of what consciousness presents. Consciousness is optimized for survival, not to present reality as it is. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. An organism does not need to know the entirety of reality. It only needs to know what is necessary for its survival. The true meaning of conscious content. Conscious content does not present us with the truth of the universe. It presents the meaning we need to understand it. Colors, shapes, sense of self, perception of time, all are useful interfaces created by the brain. Like icons on a computer screen, they don't show the internal structure of files, but they enable us to use them. Consciousness is like that too. Conclusion: experience is a construction process. Conscious content is not passive reflection, but an active construction process. The mind works silently every moment, making predictions, making corrections, and presenting you with a coherent now. And perhaps the most striking truth is this: you are inside this structure. The self you see, as much as the world you see, is a model produced by the mind. Bayesian inference. How does the brain guess the truth? Perception, as we might think, isn't simply the passive recording of information from the outside world. Our eyes aren't cameras. Our ears aren't microphones. The brain doesn't simply accept sensory signals as they are. Instead, these signals are often incomplete, noisy, and ambiguous. What we call perception is the brain's way of dealing with this ambiguity. This is where a powerful idea at the heart of modern cognitive science comes into play: Bayesian inference. perception equals best guess. Bayesian inference is based on a very simple but revolutionary principle. When faced with an unknown situation, we produce the most likely explanation based on the data we have. The brain does exactly that. The light reaching your eyes, the sound waves reaching your ears, the pressure on your skin, none of these directly represent an object, a person, or a danger. They are simply neural signals. The brain guesses what these signals might be the result of. In other words, the world you consciously perceive is not an exact copy of what's happening outside. It's the brain's best guess at what's going on. Where does Bayesian logic come from? Bayesian thinking is based on a probabilistic approach formulated by Thomas Bayes in the 18th century. This approach states, your belief about something must be updated when new information arrives. Scientists use this to understand the spread of epidemics, find lost submarines, decipher the meaning of signals from space. The brain does this unconsciously every second. The brain reasons backwards. In the outside world, there are causes. In the brain, there are effects. The sensory signals that reach the brain are not the causes themselves, but traces of the causes. Therefore, the brain must ask, what might have caused these signals? This is reasoning backward, not forward. A transition from effect to cause, just like guessing who passed by looking at footprints on the ground, assuming there's a fire when you see smoke, imagining an approaching object when you hear a sound. This is how the brain constructs perception. Predictive processing. Two-way mind. In neuroscience, this process is called predictive processing. There's a critical difference here. Information doesn't just flow into the brain from the outside. There's a two-way traffic, from outside to inside, signals from the senses, from inside to outside, the brain's expectations and predictions. The brain constantly asks the senses, is this what I expected? The main task of the signals from the outside isn't to define the world, but to tell the brain if it's wrong. Prediction error, the engine of consciousness. What the brain is really interested in is prediction error. If the prediction matches the incoming data, consciousness remains stable. If it doesn't match, there are two options. Update the predictions, adjust the data to match the prediction by changing the environment or the body. That's why we don't just perceive, we also move. We move our eyes, turn our heads, approach, move away. The goal is one thing, to reduce uncertainty. Why is reality so convincing? If perception is a prediction, why does it feel so real? Because these predictions are trained through years of experience, are evolutionarily tested, are made possible by survival. The brain's models usually work. That's why we don't question them. But sometimes, in illusions, in hallucinations, in dreams. In psychiatric disorders, we clearly see how this system works. The self is also a prediction. The most shocking conclusion in this context is, not only the world, but the self is also a Bayesian inference. What you call I is this, the most consistent model among the following: bodily signals, memory, emotions, expectations. The brain constantly updates this model. However, because the change is slow, we perceive ourselves as static, wisdom from the past. Although these ideas seem new, their roots are ancient. Buddha sensed this when he said, "The mind is the precursor of all things." Descartes doubted the unreliability of the senses. Kant argued that the mind structures the world. Modern neuroscience combines these intuitions with mathematics and experiments. Conclusion: a controlled hallucination. Conscious experience is not a free-flowing fantasy, but it is not absolute reality either. The most accurate definition is this: consciousness is a controlled hallucination for survival. Through Bayesian inference, the brain copes with uncertainty. It extracts, it produces, it creates meaning, it ensures continuity, and you live your life according to these predictions. Perhaps true freedom lies not in completely silencing this system, but in understanding how it works. The true nature of consciousness: perception, prediction, and internal experience. The way humans perceive the world is far more complex and surprising than we realize. We often feel that the information we receive from our eyes, ears, or other senses directly reflects reality. However, modern neuroscience and the psychology of perception show us that the opposite is true. Perception is essentially a predictive process of the brain. The brain constantly works from the inside out. That is, it forms our best predictions about the world, and sensory information is only used to refine these predictions. At the heart of this process lies Bayesian inference and predictive processing. Bayesian inference is a mathematical framework for reasoning under uncertainty. The brain receives ambiguous and noisy signals from the world and blends them with past experiences and learned information to form its best prediction about objects and events in the external world. For example, even if you are not seeing an object for the first time, your brain tends to recognize it because past experiences form predictions with cues such as the angle of light, shadows, and colors. When prediction errors occur, the brain corrects these errors, so our perceptual experience is constantly updated. This process is much more than a simple see-no mechanism. Our brain actually works like a prediction machine, and much of our perceptual experience stems not directly from the world, but from these predictions. For example, visual experiments like the lilac hunter illusion demonstrate how the brain actively fills in missing or ambiguous information. When your eyes focus on a point, details in the surroundings fade. This is a phenomenon known as Troxler fading. The brain generates predictions to fill in missing information and make the experience coherent. So what we see is often not reality itself, but our brain's best guess about it. This perceptual process is not limited to the visual world. It shapes our entire conscious experience. The subjectivity of an experience, the feeling of living it and being myself with it, is a product of these prediction mechanisms. As Thomas Nagel put it, the conscious mental states of an organism depend on its knowing what it looks like. In other words, consciousness is not just the brain processing information. It is also the integration of that processing with a subjective experience. The richness of our conscious experience, its conscious content, consists of sensory inputs and past information that are in constant interaction with the brain's predictive mechanisms. The brain doesn't just read data, it constantly interprets it, forms expectations, and shapes the experience. Therefore, when a person perceives a face, seeing the face is possible not only with their eyes, but also through the brain's expectation that the face will exist. This is one of the most important examples of predictive processing, demonstrating how active and structured perceptual reality is. Perception is the continuous interaction of predictions working from the inside out and sensory signals coming from the outside in. The brain constantly updates its models to minimize prediction errors. This process ensures that our conscious experience is stable and consistent. However, It also shows that perceptual and conscious experience is entirely subjective. The world we see is not exactly the same as the world we experience. At this point, an important distinction regarding the problem of consciousness emerges. Consciousness does not arise solely from the mechanical workings of the brain. As David Chalmers points out, why and how consciousness arises cannot be explained by physical processes. The interaction between the brain and body makes conscious experience possible, but the subjective nature of experience presents a mystery beyond these mechanisms. Francisco Varela's neurophenomenological approach aims to fill this gap in the science of consciousness. By simultaneously examining subjective experience and brain processes, it attempts to understand the nature of consciousness. The unique nature of perception is also related to the phenomenon of self-change blindness. People often fail to notice changes in themselves. The brain tends to perceive ourselves as less changed than we actually are in order to maintain self-perception and control mechanisms. This may be necessary for our evolutionary survival, but it also creates a challenge on the journey of personal growth and awareness. Conscious experience and perception not only enable people to understand the world, but also shape their relationship with themselves. Our perceptions and predictions guide our behavior and decisions. Whether we see an object or feel a sensation is shaped by our brain's predictions based on past experiences. Therefore, there is a constant interaction between our experience of reality and objective reality, and this interaction forms the basis of both our mental and behavioral lives. In short, consciousness and perception are not simply the brain passively collecting data. The brain constantly makes predictions, fills in gaps, and structures our experience. Bayesian inference and predictive processing form the mathematical and functional basis of this process. Our perceptual experience offers rich and subjective content. The way we experience the world is the result of the constant interaction between our predictions and sensory information. And this interaction is central not only to human consciousness, but also to subjective experience itself. Computational neurophenomenology, the reality the mind constructs from the inside out. One of the biggest problems encountered when trying to understand human consciousness is the lack of a direct bridge between what happens in the brain and our subjective experiences. We can measure the firing of nerve cells. We can image brain regions. But when we see a face, we cannot directly measure how that face appears to us. Computational neurophenomenology is an approach that emerged to fill precisely this gap. This approach aims to establish a match between subjective experience and neural processes using computational models of the brain. So the question is, when the brain operates in a certain way, what kind of experience arises in consciousness? And what computational mechanisms can explain this experience? One of the most effective ways to answer this question is to examine the system not when it is functioning normally, but when it is pushed to its limits. Because you understand how a system works best when it malfunctions or produces unusual outputs. In the case of perception and consciousness, the most striking example of these limiting situations is hallucinations. Why does the brain see things that aren't there? For most people, the word hallucination usually only conjures up pathological conditions. But the reality is much broader. The human brain is inherently predisposed to hallucinations. Seeing faces in clouds, noticing a silhouette on toast, perceiving movement as real in the dark. These are all natural byproducts of the brain's predictive system. Face perception is particularly noteworthy in this respect. The human brain has evolved to be extremely sensitive to perceiving faces. The reason is simple. Faces are vital to social life. Therefore, the brain carries an extremely sensitive prejudice about anything that could potentially be a face. As a result, we see faces even in things that aren't faces. This phenomenon is called pareidolia. This gives us an important clue. Perception is not the passive recording of data from the outside world. Perception is the projection of the brain's strong expectations onto weak sensory data. What happens if predictive power increases? According to predictive processing theory, the brain constantly makes predictions about the world. Senses act as a feedback mechanism that controls these predictions. Under normal conditions, there is a balance between predictions and sensory data. But when this balance is disrupted, perception begins to disconnect from reality. This is where computational models come into play. Researchers have tried to simulate this process using neural networks. Normally, these networks receive images and produce outputs such as, "This is a dog," "This is a building," etc. In other words, information flows from bottom to top. But when the system is reversed, that is, when the network's output is given a label like dog and run in reverse, something interesting emerges. The image begins to resemble a dog. From every corner of the current image, shapes, textures, and patterns resembling a dog begin to emerge. This essentially simulates a situation where the brain is making overly strong predictions. The hallucination machine, unraveling reality. Taking this idea a step further, an experiment called the hallucination machine was developed. People were given virtual reality glasses and shown a normal panoramic video. But in the background, the neural network constantly projected dog-like predictions onto the image. The result was striking. People didn't see the fake images where dogs were clearly placed. Instead, the world was perceived as if it were composed of dogs. The textures of trees began to resemble dogs. Dog faces appeared on the walls. Shadows moved as if they were alive. This experiment shows that hallucinations are not simple visual additions. Hallucinations are a process that radically alters how the brain constructs reality. Different hallucinations, different mechanisms. Hallucinations are not uniform. Some are extremely complex and scene-like. In Parkinson's disease, or some types of dementia, people may talk to people who aren't in the room or see detailed locations. Other hallucinations consist only of geometric shapes, flashes of light, or repetitive patterns. These differences can also be simulated through computational models. By increasing predictive power or weakening sensory feedback at different layers of the visual system, different types of hallucinations can be produced. For example, Charles Bonnet syndrome, seen in individuals with central vision loss, is characterized by a blurred center and intense hallucinatory images. This condition can be precisely replicated in models. This shows us that hallucinations are not random. Each is the result of a disruption at a different point in the brain's predictor data balance. How is experience constructed? The true power of computational neurophenomenology lies in its ability to match these models with real human experiences. Individuals experiencing hallucinations are asked to compare their own experiences with model outputs. This creates a bridge between subjective reports and computational predictions. This approach transforms consciousness from an abstract philosophical problem into an experimental and testable field of research. Francisco Varela's neurophenomenological approach, advocated years ago, is embodied here. To understand consciousness, it's not enough to simply look at the brain or simply listen to the experience. Both must be considered together. Finally, I want to say that reality is not fixed. The most striking truth revealed by these studies is this: the world we perceive is not a fixed and external reality. It is an internal model, constantly updated by our brain. The difference between normal perception and hallucination is not in type, but in degree. We are all in a controlled hallucination at every moment. Our senses are the balancing mechanisms that keep this hallucination in harmony with reality. When this balance changes even slightly, what we call reality begins to unravel. And perhaps the real question is, do we want to see reality or the safest version our brain offers us? From uncontrolled perception to self, reality, hallucination, and the illusion of self. When we begin to understand human perception, the first thing we realize is that it's not as passive a process as we thought. We don't simply receive information from the outside world and copy it into our minds. Rather, the brain constantly produces answers to the question, what's going on out there? Perception is where these answers emerge in consciousness. Therefore, modern science of consciousness now treats perception not as a process of reading, but as a process of inference and prediction. This perspective leads us to a striking concept. Hallucination is uncontrolled perception. In other words, hallucination is not an entirely different perception mechanism. It is perception itself, only in its uncontrolled form. Under normal circumstances, the brain balances its perceptual predictions with sensory data from the outside world. Predictions exist, but these predictions are constantly corrected by error signals. However, when this balance is disrupted, that is, when predictions become excessively strong and sensory feedback weakens, perception disconnects from reality. People begin to see things that others don't see. At this point, a frequently misunderstood statement comes into play. Perception is a controlled hallucination. This sentence doesn't mean that perception is entirely fabricated. On the contrary, the word control is vital here. Perception is constantly controlled by the world. Without this control, we could actually jump in front of a bus and say, it's all a hallucination anyway. But life doesn't work that way. This statement explains there is no sharp boundary between hallucination and normal perception. They are endpoints on a continuum. The basic mechanism is the same. Only the balance between prediction and error has changed. How does the brain preserve reality? When we think of the brain as a prediction machine, the purpose of perception is not to see the truth, but to produce a reality good enough for survival. This idea resonates in many fields, from evolutionary biology to neuroscience. In the 19th century, the German physiologist Hermann von Helmholtz defined perception as unconscious inference. According to him, the brain produces the most likely scenario from incomplete and uncertain sensory data. Modern Bayesian brain theories ground this intuition in a mathematical foundation. The brain constantly asks itself, based on my past experiences, what is most likely happening to me right now? The colors, sounds, sense of depth we perceive, even the feeling that objects are really there, are all products of this inference. The sense of reality is part of perception. It is not the result of perception. What happens when control is lost? Hallucinations indicate moments when this system loses control. Detailed scene hallucinations seen in Parkinson's patients, imaginary people appearing in some types of dementia, or images that appear in sensory deprivation. These are all situations where the brain's capacity to produce predictions is out of control. However, there is an important point here. Even hallucinations are not random. Each hallucination reflects the brain's expectations. A brain predisposed to seeing faces sees faces. A mind raised on cultural imagery produces these images. Therefore, hallucinations reveal the contents of the mind. Carl Jung's statement that the unconscious speaks in symbols finds a different equivalent in modern neuroscience. The brain expresses its predictions through images, from perception to self. Self is also a perception. This way of thinking leads us to a much more disturbing but equally illuminating point. What if the self is also a perception? In everyday life, we are accustomed to thinking of the self as the perceiver. As if there were a world outside, the senses gather data from that world, and a fixed self inside monitors this data. However, this picture is becoming increasingly scientifically unsustainable. The self is not a center that stands outside of perception. The self is a product of perception itself. Just as colors, sounds, and objects arise from the brain's predictions, the feelings of, I am here, this body is mine, and I have continuity in time, are also the result of a similar inference process. The self is a special internal model that the brain creates to keep the body and mind under control. This model is so successful that we perceive it as real. Why does the self feel like a single piece? Under normal circumstances, the experience of the self is unified. We feel that we are the same person. Yesterday I was, today I am, and tomorrow I will be. This sense of continuity stems from the brain's stable predictions. However, in some neurological and psychiatric conditions, this unity is disrupted. Individuals experiencing depersonalization feel as if they are observing themselves from the outside. In some brain injuries, a person does not feel that their own arm belongs to them. In cases of multiple personality disorder, the self is experienced as fragmented. These conditions show us that the self is not a single, unchanging essence. The self is a constantly updated perception. As David Hume said centuries ago, when I look inside, I find not a self, but perceptions. Modern neuroscience has begun to support this philosophical intuition with experimental data. What we have learned so far: reality and self are constructed. Perception is a controlled hallucination. The self is a controlled perception. Our perception of reality is a successful reflection of the brain. These are not pessimistic conclusions, but rather liberating ones. Because this perspective tells us that understanding our minds is not about losing our connection with reality. It's about realizing how we construct it. Perhaps the true awakening of consciousness is this: we don't see reality, we experience it. And what we call I is the most ingenious illusion placed at the center of this experience. Different types of self. Is what we call I really one thing? In everyday life, we think of what we call I as a single, fixed, and indivisible structure, as if there were a center within us, a thinking, feeling, deciding, and always unchanging essence. However, the science of consciousness, neuroscience, and neurological cases present us with a completely different picture. In reality, there is no single self. The self consists of many layers that interact with each other. Because these layers generally work in harmony, we experience them as a single whole. But when any part of the system breaks down, we realize just how fragile and artificial what we call self really is. 1. The bodily self. This body is mine. The most fundamental layer of the self is the bodily self. This isn't simply saying, I have a body. It's something deeper. I am this body. We feel an intuitive boundary between where the body ends and the world begins. Our skin, muscles, internal organs, all are in the realm of the self. The table, chair, and wall are outside. Although this distinction seems natural to us, it is actually a perception created by the brain. Some extraordinary experiences show that this perception can be deciphered. People who have out-of-body experiences describe seeing themselves from above, their bodies from the outside. Such experiences show that the idea that the self resides at a fixed point behind the eyes is not a necessity. In other words, the bodily self is not an innate reality. It is the best estimate that the brain constantly produces. 2. The perceptual self. First-person perspective. Another dimension of the self is the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective. The world seems to be viewed from a central point behind our eyes. Sounds come toward us. Images are positioned relative to us. However, this perspective can also be changed. In some neurological disorders, people perceive the world as detached, distant, or artificial. This shows that even the perspective isn't fixed. The self isn't just about what is, it's also about where one is looking from. 3. Will-based self. I did this. Another powerful layer of the self is the will-based self. This is the self in which we feel we are the cause of our actions. When we raise a glass, start a conversation, or make a decision, the feeling of I did this arises within us. This feeling is at the heart of free will debates. However, experiments show that this feeling isn't always real time. In some cases, the brain produces the I did it narrative after the action has taken place. Therefore, the feeling of will can also be a layer of self-constructed later. This doesn't mean our actions are meaningless. However, it shows that what we call the decision maker is not as central and absolute as we think. 4. The narrative self. I as a story. The self that gives a sense of continuity in time is called the narrative self. This self is shaped by our name, our memories, our past, and our expectations for the future. I was like this as a child. I experienced this. I will do this in the future. These are all stories the brain tells about itself. As long as this story is consistent, the self feels consistent. But when memory is impaired, the narrative self also collapses. The case of Clive Waring is very striking here. Due to severe amnesia, Clive was living in a now that lasted about 10 seconds. There was no past, no future. For him, every moment was experienced for the first time. But what is interesting is this: the music is still there. While playing the piano, while conducting the orchestra, the narrative self temporarily reintegrates. This shows us that the self is not a single center, but a combination of different systems. Some may collapse while others remain standing. 5. The social self. The self that exists in the minds of others. One of the least noticed but most powerful aspects of the self is the social self. This is the self that emerges in interaction with others. Who we are is largely determined by how others see us, how they know us, and how they relate to us. It is no coincidence that people who have been alone for a long time say, "I don't feel like myself." Part of the self is projected in the minds of others. When this projection disappears, the self feels incomplete. The fragility of the bodily self, the rubber hand illusion. One of the most famous experiments demonstrating how flexible the bodily self is the rubber hand illusion. The experiment is simple. Your real hand is hidden from your field of vision. A fake hand is placed in front of you. Your real hand and the fake hand are stroked simultaneously in the same way. After some time, many people begin to feel the prosthetic hand as a part of their own body. This shows that the brain answers the question, "What is my body?" through sensory matching. If what it sees, feels, and expects matches, the boundaries of the self are redrawn. In other words, the body is not as static as we think. The self is a constantly updated model. Perception is not a reality, it's an assumption. We live with a very strong assumption in our daily lives. The things we see are there. The sounds we hear are real. And what we call I is a fixed entity at the center of these experiences. But modern neuroscience tells us something far more shocking. Perception is not a complete copy of the external world. It is a controlled assumption made by the brain. The brain doesn't see the world directly. It only receives signals from the senses and produces the most likely story from them. Therefore, perception is not a passive recording, as is commonly believed. It is an active inference process. That's why the statement by some neuroscientists is so important. Perception is a controlled hallucination. This statement is often misunderstood, as if the world weren't real, as if everything were fabricated. But that's not the point. The controlled part is vital, because these assumptions are constantly corrected by the real world. When you jump in front of a bus, your brain doesn't have room to hallucinate. Reality sharply corrects the prediction. But this statement tells us there is no sharp wall between hallucination and normal perception. The difference between them is not the mechanism used, it is the balance. If predictions become too dominant, the brain begins to see its own story, not the world. And people see things that others don't see. The same mechanism works in all our experiences. This system doesn't only apply to sight, colors, sounds, touch, taste. Even the perception of time works on the same principle. Whether a moment feels long or short, why a face looks familiar, why an image feels real. These are all the result of perceptual inferences made by the brain. Even the perception of reality is the labeling of signals from the outside world as, "This is consistent." So what we call reality is the brain's sense of trust in its own model. But what about the self? This is the most disturbing point. We usually think like this. There is a world out there. There is a self that perceives data from this world. And this self is a fixed observer at the center of perception. But neuroscience says this isn't true. The self is also a perception, just like colors, just like sounds, just like time. The self is a very specific, controlled hallucination produced by the brain. But the difference is this. This hallucination is the experience of being yourself. That's why questioning the self is difficult. Because the thing that questions is the thing being questioned. In daily life, we perceive the self as a single, integrated structure. The same self that wakes up in the morning, moves around throughout the day, goes from meeting to meeting. However, this sense of wholeness is a successful synthesis by the brain. In reality, the self is a combined estimate of bodily sensations, memories, expectations, internal signals, and social roles. The rubber hand illusion, how ownership is constructed. One of the experiments that most clearly demonstrates this is the rubber hand illusion. A person's real hand is hidden. A fake hand is placed in front of them. Both the real and fake hands are stroked simultaneously. After a while, the person begins to feel, this rubber hand is mine. This is not just a game. This shows how the brain constructs the feeling of ownership. What is even more interesting is this. This illusion is not equally strong for everyone. Some people are affected very quickly. Others are hardly affected at all. Research shows that as sensitivity to suggestions increases, the illusion strengthens. In other words, the brain's expectations shape the perception itself. This tells us what we experience isn't just sensations. What the brain expects at that moment is also part of the experience. People who reject their real limbs. But it doesn't end there. In some neurological cases, people even reject their own real arms. The arm is attached to their shoulder. They see it. They touch it. But still, they say, this isn't mine. This isn't a simple illusion. This shows how deeply ingrained the sense of ownership is. The rubber hand illusion shows us the system. These cases show what happens when the system breaks down. So, having a body is not just a physical reality, it's a perceptual achievement. Having a body, or living, here we go deeper. Having a body is one thing, but what it feels like to live is something entirely different. Most of the time, we don't even realize it. But in fact, this is the most fundamental layer of the experience of being yourself. The brain's oldest task is not thinking. It's not writing poetry. It's not making plans. The brain's primary task is this: to keep the body alive. And to do this, it constantly engages with internal perception. The free energy principle, the hidden math of survival. Until now, we've seen that perception, self, and experience consist of predictions made by the brain. But why does this prediction mechanism exist? Why does the brain constantly try to predict the world? The deepest and most comprehensive answer to this question is the free energy principle. This idea is one of the most powerful frameworks attempting to explain not only perception, but also behavior, learning, emotions, and even why the self exists. And this principle has been transformed into a systematic theory by neuroscientist Carl Friston. The common secret of living systems. The free energy principle begins with a very simple but striking assumption. Everything that lives preserves itself over time. This sentence seems ordinary at first glance, but upon closer examination, it contains the common mathematics of all life. Consider a fish. A fish is a fish in water. As long as it is in water, it remains a fish. But if you take it out of the water and put it on a table, after a short time, it is no longer a fish. Its structure breaks down. It falls apart. It becomes incredibly fragile. A common characteristic of living systems is this: they can only exist under certain conditions. When these conditions are disrupted, the system collapses. Countless situations. You cannot be in now. Apply this to yourself. There are countless physical and mental states you can be in, but the vast majority of these are situations in which you cannot survive. Extreme heat, extreme cold, oxygen-free environment, prolonged food shortage, extreme chaos. In most of these situations, there is no longer a you. So survival is about managing to remain within a very narrow range of possible states. This is the brain's primary task. The brain's real task: to protect you from falling apart. The brain did not evolve to think. The brain did not arise to philosophize. The brain wasn't even designed to produce happiness. The brain's fundamental function is this: to prevent the organism from falling apart. The tools it uses to do this are prediction error control. In other words, all the mechanisms we discussed earlier. The brain constantly asks the question, what will happen next? Because surprise is dangerous for the organism. What is free energy? The concept of free energy here is not exactly the same as energy in physics. This concept roughly expresses how much uncertainty the brain experiences about the world. The more surprises there are, the more unpredictable situations are, the higher the free energy. And living systems cannot survive in situations of high uncertainty. Therefore, all living things, consciously or unconsciously, behave in a way that reduces free energy. Perception, movement, and learning serve the same purpose. There's a very important point here. Perception, movement, and learning are not actually separate things. They all serve the same purpose: to reduce the unexpected. Perception predicts what the world is like. Learning updates the predictions. Behavior adapts the world to the predictions. So sometimes the brain adapts to the world, and sometimes it adapts the world to itself. That's why you look for food when you're hungry. You warm yourself when you're cold. You run away when you feel danger. These don't all have to be conscious decisions. The system works automatically. Why is the self so persistent? Now let's go back to the self. Why is the self such a powerful emotion? Why is it so difficult to decipher the feeling of I? Because the self is one of the highest level predictive models the brain produces to keep the organism stable. The self is an internal story that says, this body is mine. These feelings belong to me. This continuity is mine. And if this story collapses, the entire balance of the organism is disrupted. Therefore, the self is not just a psychological concept, it is a biological necessity. Things philosophy foresaw long ago. Although these ideas may seem new, great thinkers actually foresaw them. Heraclitus is saying, "You cannot step into the same river twice," is one of the first blows against the idea of a fixed self. Buddha's teaching, "There is no permanent essence," says that the self is a temporary construct. Spinoza, on the other hand, defines the fundamental driving force of existence as follows: conatus, the effort to continue to exist. The principle of free energy places these intuitions on a mathematical and biological basis. Why does it happen? Why is the self so stable? Now, we come to the most important question. Yes, perception is a prediction. Yes, the self is also a perception. But why is this perception so stable? Why do we feel like we are the same person, that we haven't changed? The answer lies in the workings of the brain. The brain constantly predicts the world to keep you alive. But for these predictions to work, they need something. That what they predict is stable. And one of the brain's most fundamental assumptions is this organism will remain largely the same over time. The stability of the self is not an assumption, it's a necessity. The brain's predictions cannot withstand a constantly changing self. If the self changed radically every moment, learning would be impossible, habits wouldn't form, goals wouldn't be consistent. In short, survival would become impossible. Therefore, the brain is forced to assume that the self is fixed. And here's where the striking part begins. This assumption becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We feel unchanging. Because we assume we are unchanging to survive, the brain assumes, "I will not change." Thanks to this assumption, behaviors become consistent. The body is regulated, identity is preserved, and this process works so well that subjectively we feel, "I am always the same person." But in reality, your cells change. Your memories are rewritten. Your beliefs transform. But you don't experience this directly, because the brain works in a way that makes change invisible. Blindness to the changing self. That's why we often fail to notice how much we ourselves have changed. This is not a mistake. This is not a flaw. This is a natural consequence of the survival mechanism. If we perceive constant and clear change, identity collapses. Decision-making mechanisms weaken. The sense of continuity is lost. The brain cannot tolerate this. Therefore, the subjective stability of the self is not a byproduct, but a fundamental pillar of conscious life. This is not just for the self. This mechanism is not limited to identity. It is the same in all our experiences with our bodies. The brain needs to experience the body as a structure that will last a long time. Predictable, controllable. Therefore, we feel the body as one piece. The sense of ownership is strong. The feeling of, "This is my body," is clear. This is the organism's most effective survival strategy. Integrating the self makes survival easier. An integrated sense of self is not a random psychological state. This allows the organism to manage its actions from a single center. Consider this: a fragmented self, a constantly changing self, an inconsistent identity. Such a structure cannot react quickly to danger. But an integrated self makes quick decisions, anticipates risks in advance, uses energy efficiently. Therefore, the brain prefers the self to feel one and the same. From perception to self. The big picture. Now we can clearly see this. What we consciously perceive is the brain's best guess about the causes of sensory signals. Experiments like the rubber hand illusion show that this mechanism applies not only to the external world, but also to the self itself. That is, the hand can give the feeling of mine. Body boundaries can change. The feeling of ownership can change. But deeper down, this system continues to work. What truly matters, the body's internal order. Here we come to a very critical point. The brain's predictions aren't just about perceiving the body as an object. What's really important is this: heart rhythm, respiration, heat-energy balance. In other words, the regulation of the internal physiological state. This process is called interoception. And this is the basis of all perception. The necessity of survival lies at the heart of perception. Let's put the whole picture together. Perception, self-consciousness, identity, continuity. All of these stem from a single necessity: the necessity of survival. All these predictive mechanisms that emerged in the process of evolution and development are a result of the need to keep the body alive. We perceive the world not through an abstract consciousness, but through our living bodies.